At an age when most men hand over their car keys, 80-year-old Arthur Callahan was plotting a 3,000-mile voyage across the vast open ocean. His house in a quiet Florida suburb looked like any other, with a manicured lawn and a mailbox bearing the Callahan name, faded with the years. But inside the garage, a completely different world existed. This was no place for lawn tools or old Christmas decorations. Arthur's garage was a miniature boat works, permeated by the smell of pine, oil paint, and the unmistakable scent of salt water. The center of this world was the Serenity, a 36-foot sailboat. It wasn't a glamorous yacht, but a true working vessel, with a hull that Arthur himself had reinforced and sails he had patched countless times. On the adjacent wall, charts of the North Atlantic were penned up, covered in pencil notes about currents, wind patterns, and dangerous waters. This wasn't a retirement hobby, it was an obsession, a promise he had made to himself more than half a century ago. Arthur had once been a man of the sea. As a young man in the U.S. Navy, the ocean was his playground, his classroom, and his adversary. He had learned to read the waves like a book, to understand the whisper of the wind, and to respect its terrifying power. The sea had forged him into a man. But then life on land had called to him. He met Eleanor, the love of his life, a woman with a smile that could chase away the darkest of clouds, and a fear of the sea that ran bone deep. He had promised her he would set aside his voyages to build a life with her, and he had kept his word. He became an engineer, a husband, a father. He built a home, raised 2 children, and built model ships in bottles to soothe his longing for the sea. Every vacation, the family would go to the beach, and while Eleanor and the kids built sandcastles, Arthur would stand at the water's edge, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart pulled towards some distant place. He loved his family more than anything, but a part of him was always offshore, drifting on unseen currents. After Eleanor passed away 3 years ago, the house became too quiet, too large. That silence felt like a mockery, reminding him of the promises he had kept and the dreams he had abandoned. The final push came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. A sharp pain in his chest, a rushed trip to the hospital, and the words of a young doctor. "Mr. Callahan, this was a warning. You've had a minor heart attack. From now on, you need to take it easy. No exertion, no stress." Take it easy? The phrase echoed in Arthur's mind as he sat in his living room, staring at Eleanor's picture on the mantel. What did taking it easy mean? Waiting? Waiting for another heart attack, another decline, until there was nothing left but memories? Eleanor wouldn't have wanted that. She would have wanted him to live, to truly live. In that moment, a decision was made. It wasn't a reckless challenge, but a calm acceptance. He would not take it easy. He would set sail. He would make the journey he had traced in his mind 1,000 times, a solo crossing of the Atlantic from Florida to the Azores Islands of Portugal. It wasn't an act of running from death. It was an act of racing toward life. His daughter Sarah pleaded with him. "Dad, are you crazy? You're 80 years old. You can't do this alone." But when she looked into her father's eyes, she saw not madness, but a clarity, a purpose she hadn't seen in him for years. He began his preparations. Every day from dawn till dusk he worked on the Serenity. He checked every bolt, every rope. He installed a modern satellite navigation system next to his old brass compass. He stocked enough food for 60 days, canned goods, dried rations, and jars of peanut butter. He didn't tell many people. The neighbors just thought he was busy with a new project. They couldn't imagine that the quiet old man who waved to them each morning was planning one of the greatest and most solitary adventures of a lifetime. On the day of departure, the Florida sky was a flawless, cloudless blue. Sarah and her 2 grandchildren stood on the dock, their faces a mixture of worry and admiration. Arthur hugged his daughter tightly. "Don't you worry about me," he said, his voice firm. "The sea and I, we understand each other." As the Serenity slowly pulled away from the dock, its sails catching the trade wind, Arthur didn't look back. He set his eyes forward toward the endless expanse of blue water. The Florida coastline grew smaller until it was just a faint line on the horizon, and then it disappeared completely. He was alone, a tiny speck on a vast ocean, with a compass and a dream too long deferred. The first week passed like a waking dream. Arthur fell into the rhythm of the sea, a symphony he had long known by heart. The day began with a brilliant dawn that painted the sea pink and ended with constellations sparkling in a night sky untainted by city lights. He felt young again, not like an 80-year-old man, but like that 20-year-old sailor from long ago, with suntanned skin and a heart full of life. He moved about the deck with a surprising grace, his calloused but steady hands working with practiced ease, adjusting the sails to catch the slightest breeze, tying complex knots without looking. The Serenity glided smoothly over the water, and pods of dolphins often swam alongside, their silver bodies leaping from the water as if to welcome an old friend home. He talked to them, and he talked to Eleanor. Her photograph was taped securely next to the helm. "You see, Elle? I made it," he whispered to the wind. "It's just as beautiful as I always told you it would be." He wasn't lonely. He had the sky, the sea, and his memories. During the day, he was busy running the boat, checking his course and writing in his logbook. At night, he would sit on the deck, sipping a cup of hot tea, and let the great silence of the ocean envelop him. This was absolute freedom, a release from the constraints of time and the worries of the land. But the ocean is a fickle lover. On the 15th day, the sky began to change. The fluffy white clouds gave way to streaks of gray, stretching like scars across the sky. The wind began to howl instead of whisper, and the gentle waves now grew angry, slapping against the Serenity's hull with increasing force. Arthur knew a storm was coming. He had studied the weather reports, but in the middle of the Atlantic, a forecast is only an educated guess. He quickly prepared. He lowered the mainsail, secured everything on deck, and put on his waterproof foul-weather gear. He wasn't scared. Instead, a familiar feeling, a dangerous excitement coursed through his veins. This was the real test. The storm hit at dusk. The sky and the sea merged into a terrifying dark gray. Rain whipped against his face like needles. Waves as high as 2-story buildings lifted the Serenity to their crests and then dropped it into a watery valley. The little boat groaned under the immense pressure. Inside the cabin, anything not tied down flew about chaotically. Arthur clung to the helm, his body braced against every jolt. He didn't fight the storm, he danced with it, using all his experience to keep the boat's nose pointed into the waves, to keep from being capsized. For 12 straight hours, he was a part of that chaos. He didn't eat, he didn't sleep, he focused on one single goal: survival. He yelled into the wind, not in fear, but in defiance, an affirmation of his own existence. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised sky and a sea that was still catching its breath. Arthur was exhausted but alive. He checked the damage. The Serenity had held up remarkably well, but not without a cost. The main radio antenna had snapped, and the long-range communication system was completely silent. He was cut off from the world. No one knew where he was, and he couldn't call for help even if he wanted to. The solitude now took on a different meaning. It was no longer freedom, but absolute isolation. The next few days were a mental battle. The silence from the radio was a tangible void. Doubt began to creep into his mind. Had he been overconfident? Was this decision a foolish act of an old man? He looked at Eleanor's picture. Her face now seemed to look worried. He imagined Sarah's voice begging him to turn back. There were moments, staring out at the endless ocean, when he felt so small and helpless that he wanted to give up. But then he would look at his own hands, the hands that had built a life, repaired this boat, and held the helm through the storm. He would remember the doctor's words, "Take it easy," and a fire would ignite again within him. He hadn't come this far only to die in silence. One evening, as he sat on deck feeling more dejected than ever, a magical sight appeared. A massive humpback whale surfaced not far from the boat. It blew a plume of spray that sparkled in the sunset, then slowly dived back down, its enormous tail waving a silent goodbye. That moment, brief but powerful, shattered Arthur's loneliness. He was not alone. He was part of this vast, wondrous world. He smiled, a real smile for the first time in days. He managed to fix the short-range backup radio, just enough to catch weather signals. He continued his voyage, not with the confidence of the first week, but with a deeper humility and resolve. He had faced the ocean's fury and his own fragility, and he was still here, still sailing east towards the rising sun. After the storm, time seemed to move differently. Each day was no longer marked by the excitement of discovery, but by the persistence of endurance. Arthur's 80-year-old body began to protest. His joints ached, his muscles were weary. He lost weight, and the sun and sea breeze etched deeper lines into his face. But his eyes were different. They were clearer, brighter, holding a wisdom that can only be found in those who have looked into the abyss and returned. He had become one with the serenity. The boat was no longer a vessel, but an extension of his own body. He felt every creak of its wooden frame, every vibration of the sails. He knew exactly when to adjust, when to rest. They were an old pair, weathering the final stretch together. The food supply began to dwindle. He had to ration his portions carefully, eating just enough to maintain his strength. Fresh water became the most precious commodity. But the material lack seemed only to sharpen his spirit. He realized how little he needed to survive, and how little he needed to be happy. Happiness was simply the feel of the warm sun on his skin after a cold night, the taste of a fish he had just caught, the sight of a strange seabird signaling that land was near. On the 47th day, he smelled it, a faint scent in the air, not the salt of the sea, but the damp scent of soil, of decaying vegetation. It was the smell of life on land. His heart beat faster. He climbed the mast, his legs trembling, and squinted at the horizon, and then he saw it, a faint outline, almost indistinguishable from the clouds, but it was there, solid and unchanging. Land. He didn't shout. He just sank down, leaning against the mast, and let tears stream down his gaunt face. They were tears of relief, of satisfaction, and of a bittersweet sadness that the journey was almost over. A few days later, he sailed into the port of Horta on the island of Fayal in the Azores, a legendary stopover for transatlantic sailors. As the Serenity, with its faded sails and scarred hull, entered the harbor, the local people and other sailors stopped to watch. They saw the small, old boat, and then they saw the solitary man at the helm, a thin, old man with a white beard and hair, but standing tall and proud. News spread quickly through the small port community. An 80-year-old man, alone, on an old sailboat, had just crossed the Atlantic. It was almost unbelievable. When Arthur took his first unsteady steps on solid ground, a group of people approached. They weren't intrusive, but simply stood there with respect. An older man, the owner of a harborside bar, walked up and handed Arthur a glass of wine. "Welcome," he said in broken English. "You are a legend." Arthur just smiled and nodded, too tired to speak. He found a public telephone and called Sarah. When she answered, he could only manage 3 words. "I'm here, honey." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence, and then it broke into sobs of relief. The story of Arthur Callahan quickly spread beyond the small island. International news agencies came calling. They wanted to know about the storm, the loneliness, the fear. Arthur, after he had rested and shaved, answered their questions calmly. But he realized they couldn't truly understand. They spoke of conquering the ocean. Arthur knew that no one conquers the ocean. One can only learn to respect it and hope it grants you passage. They spoke of courage. Arthur knew it wasn't courage, but the refusal to surrender to fear. A few weeks later, Sarah flew to the Azores. When she saw her father, she almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner, older, but there was a light in his eyes she had never seen before. He was no longer the quiet father living in nostalgia. He had truly lived. They spent time together repairing the Serenity. Arthur decided he wouldn't sell it. He would leave it in Horta as a monument to the voyage. He would fly home. His adventure was over. On his last day in the Azores, he walked alone to a headland overlooking the sea. He didn't think about the past or the future. He was simply present, feeling the wind on his face and listening to the sound of the waves. The journey hadn't added years to his life, but it had added life to his years. Arthur Callahan had not just crossed an ocean, but he had crossed the vast distance between a life that was ending and one that had just truly begun, proving that the greatest adventures are not reserved for the young, but for the brave who dare to answer the call of their own hearts. Arthur's story is more than just a voyage across the ocean. It is a reminder that within each of us lies an uncharted sea, a dream waiting to set sail. If this story resonated with you, please share your reflections in the comments below. This is a space for stories like these. And to continue following the extraordinary journeys of other legends, consider joining our community by subscribing.